Welcome, everybody. Spiraling in Silence, How Anxiety Damages Relationships and Intimacy, and How to Stop It. We are
Mhm.
so excited that you're here joining us today. We are going to dive into all of your burning questions and share all the things we wish somebody had told us. But Brittany, welcome.
Yeah, thanks for having me, Erin.
I'm so excited to chat. So tell us who you are, what you like to do, what your jam is.
Yeah, what my jam is. I'm Brittany Webb. I'm a licensed professional counselor, so I can see folks in like Maryland, New Jersey, Pennsylvania, and Virginia. So a couple different spots. I'm also a certified clinical anxiety treatment professional, which is a mouthful to say. So that's why I was not saying it very quickly. Um, I specialize in anxiety and OCD in adults, and the founder of a group practice known as Better Minds Counseling and Services. But also, aside from all the clinical things, I enjoy kind of outside the therapy chair and hiking with my dog, spending time with my cat when I'm reading and she's snuggled up with me, baking, and also making different coffee syrups. So
Homemade
that's
coffee
fun.
syrups?
Yeah.
Oh my God,
So
so fancy.
I don't have a spring one, so that I'm still like in the market if anyone has ideas, but typically I like to make pumpkin pie syrup or pumpkin spice syrup. And I've made like just brown sugar ones and yeah, that's I really enjoy that. So,
That
yeah.
sounds amazing.
Mhm.
Oh,
Yeah.
yeah.
Amazing. Well,
I'm so
Erin, tell
excited.
me about you. I don't know
Yes, I'm
anything
so
about you.
excited that we're teaming up today. For those of you that are new to my world, I'm Erinn. I'm a sex therapist and intimacy expert, and I specialize in helping women with low desire stop feeling like sex is a chore so they can start looking forward to it again and get that deeper level of connection. Because yes, when sex feels like an obligation, like that's no good, you don't want to do it. But it's not just about the sex, right? It's about how it takes a bigger toll on your relationship, and life is too short to be fighting about all the little things and fighting about intimacy and like dreading bedtime. So I help women transform their love lives and relationships with my three-phase method through my online program, Desire to Fire. And I also, like Brittany, outside of the therapy room, outside, that is where you will find me with my dog who's barking at squirrels, right? Like I like hiking, I like running, I like kayaking. So I am outdoors whenever I can be. And I'm very excited that it's finally getting a little bit warmer to get out there. But I'm also really excited to team up with Brittany today and talk about something that I think doesn't get talked about as often as it should be because a lot of people just suffer in silence and they don't
Mhm.
talk about these things. So why don't we start with like what anxiety is?
Yeah, I like to think about it as kind of three different parts. Anxiety shows up like mentally, emotionally, and physically. So I think of like mentally that being like overthinking, catastrophizing. That's sometimes a hard word to say. Um, fear of abandonment, hypervigilance, this kind of like indecisiveness, especially thinking when we're like really got a lot going on. That's really hard to make decisions in those moments. And even like self-doubt. And then like emotionally, I really think about like maybe feeling like mood swings or that vulnerability, guilt and shame, and even like avoiding conflict. Uh, Erin, I want to pass it to you because I know you talk a lot about the physical aspects when it comes to anxiety.
I do all day long, all day, every day.
Hmm.
Because I think how I talk about it is the stress response, right? It's like your fight or flight that kicks on. Because I think what happens is that we overlook that it's just an emotional piece and we forget about this physical, right? So, like, things that happen when we're in this activated state is that, like, our digestion shuts down and we have difficulty sleeping because we were flooded with adrenaline and cortisol and all these things that are like activating and are helpful in that state, but then make it really hard to rest. And we have cravings, right? Like we crave like sugar because we need that quick energy to like fight or flee when they're in that state. I mean, the decision making part of our brain even goes offline because we don't have time to like sit and assess. Like if we're in a stressful situation, I always use a car barreling down the sidewalk. If a car is barreling down me on the sidewalk, I don't have time to sit and be like, okay, how fast do I think that car is going? And how fast can I run and jump out of the way? No, we have to react, right? So there are very real physical changes that happen in our body like instantly that we don't
Hmm.
even know. And over time, that takes a toll on our bodies, right? Like tension headaches, prolonged muscle tension, like high blood pressure. This all happens from prolonged anxiety and stress. And it's really hard on us. And people don't even realize
Hmm.
what's going on.
Yeah, that's a lot. And right, like that happens so quickly.
So quickly. Yeah.
Or automatically, right? Like especially that physical kind of stuff at times.
Exactly. Well, and it's making me think. So, Brittany, I think one of the questions we got for you that I think would be a good kicking off place for this is like, how do I bring up anxiety in my relationship without it making it seem like a burden?
Mm, that's a really great question. And I think there's a lot of things that can be said about that question. So I think of one, the biggest maybe kind of starting point is really identifying ways that anxiety presents for you, because it presents differently for everyone. We have a mix of mentally, emotionally, physically, and it can shift at different points. But I think in familiarizing ourselves makes it easier than to communicate that with our partner um, in these situations, in identifying how anxiety really shows up. I think of then having that conversation with your partner to during calm times. Because if you're feeling anxious and trying to enter in a conversation, it's not really going to go the best, I have to say, because you might feel like you're trying to cover everything, you're not explaining things well, you get too wrapped up, and it's just like a snowball, just gets bigger and bigger rolling down that hill. Um, and I also think of like it's very interesting that part of without making it seem like I'm a burden. I think of like there's one, and being a therapist, so many different ways to explore that I think about. But really understanding like why is that showing up and being almost like curious about it without judging yourself in that way. So I think of those things really being the first things to kind of focus on in entering into before entering into a conversation with your partner. Think of kind of like that.
I think that's such an amazing way to
Hmm.
think about it too, because this idea of coming from a calm place is really resonating with me. It's making me think about how nobody's a mind reader, right? And
Hmm.
like in relationships, we want people to know what we want, but they're still not mind readers. But coming at it from this like agitated, stressed, overwhelmed place, like how hard it is to even share what we're thinking and feeling versus actually having that other person hear what we're saying
Yep.
and how important the
Yeah.
calm piece is in that.
Hmm. Yeah. Well, and I think of, I mean, like, how do you foresee that kind of like relating to what you hear from your clients?
It's actually really funny that you say that because coming from this calm place, it's making me think of a question that I got where I was not in a calm place when I read this question. Because, but it's making me think about like this, like general, like how do I bring up these frustrations, right? Or like something that I hear a lot from my clients is like, how do I talk to like my husband about sex? Like it's a really delicate topic. He feels really rejected, but I got a question from a woman that I want to check out with you, and I want to vent about it and not be calm for a minute because
Yeah.
what she
Rant
was
on.
I'm gonna rant about it because this is what I do. I get on my soapbox and I
Yeah.
rant about it. But it like broke my heart when I read this because she reached out and she said something along the lines of like, how do I talk to my partner about this? Because she said, my partner told me that my vagina felt different and then it felt stretched out. And this created a lot of anxiety for her. And she was like, I don't want to be intimate at all. Like, I know that I need to get out of my head, but like, how do I make this better for him? And I had many feelings, and I sat in my feelings, I went through all my feelings. But I think there's a lot to unpack here. And I think the first is that it's really frustrating that nobody teaches us how this shit works, right? Like so many women don't know how their sex drive works, don't know how their body works. So the first thing that I want to normalize here is that your vagina does not get stretched out. It does not get like irreparably stretched out when you have sex. That's just not how it works, right? The more sex you have, it doesn't loosen your vagina. That's a myth from our like very uninformed society, right? That taught you that and taught your partner that. He probably doesn't know that either. But I think about it like it's muscle, right?
Hmm.
Like if I have a nice juicy cheeseburger and I have to open my mouth really wide to eat it, it doesn't get stuck like that. I can eat a bunch of burgers and my mouth is going to not get stuck like that, right? It's just a muscle. So I want to normalize this and I want to normalize what happens in the body because I think that can make this stuff easier to talk about. Because, like Brittany was saying, it can help you calm
Mhm.
and figure out what's going on for you first and then enter into this dialogue. So, for the person that asked this question, what happens to your vagina during sexual response is it tense. There's something called vaginal tenting. And what that is that your vagina expands and it like expands back and up under your cervix. Right? From a biological perspective, it does this to accommodate a penis. And why it does this is because it is more pleasurable for you when this happens. Right? A super tight
Mhm.
vagina is a painful vagina for most women, right? So we're not going to glorify the tight vagina. We're not going to like look at it through this lens, right? We're going to glorify pleasure. So when you think about this, it's not about shrinking your vagina. It's not about tensing your muscles. We don't want that. But because I want to leave you with like a tip and not just like vent at you about this, what you could try after you talk to him and make sure that we all know how a vagina works, what you could try is different positions for increased friction, if that's something that would be pleasurable to you, right? Like spooning with your
Mhm.
legs closed or laying down on your stomach with your legs closed and him behind you, right? But do not fall prey to these unrealistic sex, I call them sexpectations or expectations about sex, because they increase our anxiety. And then we can't come from this calm place like Brittany was talking about. And then we can't have this open dialogue because everybody's in their head and now we're judged and now we're anxious and now it's way worse.
Mhm.
Make sense?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. I think that's really hard, right? Whenever you have expectations or sexpectations in a situation, whether it's from your partner or even from yourself.
And I think it's really hard when it comes to the sexual response too. And it's making me think of a couple other questions I got. This maybe would be a good segue. Is
Mm.
that it's really hard because like we were all taught certain things about sexual response and what that looks like in relationship, but so were our partners. So we like unintentionally reinforce these things or like don't know how to talk about them and don't know how to shift them because it's just all this like unhelpful, unrealistic beliefs that we were taught and we don't know how to get through them, you know? Like
Mhm.
another question that I got, something I hear all the time is, right, like, how do I get out of my head? I can't stay present during sex, right? Or like, I enjoy it once we start, but I'm never in the mood in the first place, or I feel guilt for taking too long. All of these are the expectations. So the shoulds, right? How long it should take you, how long it should take you to orgasm, how often you should orgasm, all that shit, how often you should be having sex, whatever. But somebody else asked about this idea of like taking too long and feeling selfish for focusing on herself, right? Because she was trying to be interested, but was feeling really out of balance from her husband because she was thinking about herself. And it was such a good question. And I want to check it out with you, Brittany, and get your thoughts on it because it was making me think about how sex drive works in general, right?
Mm.
Because knowing how our brain works, knowing how our body works, like how powerful is that when we actually know what's going on for us? And so for this person that was asking about feeling selfish because you were taking too long, I want to normalize sex drive for women for a second. Because there's a difference between desire, which is your interest, and arousal, which is like the physical response, it's the blood flowing. Right? So when we think about sexual response, what we mainly think about is spontaneous desire. It's what we see in the movies, like Hollywood passion, like I have to have you now. And we swipe everything off the table and like all these crazy positions always work and nobody needs a lube and like nobody's hair gets pulled, whatever, right?
Also, that you're okay with things getting swiped onto the ground.
That
I just
doesn't
want to
give you
also put
great
that out there.
anxiety that now all of the dishes in the
Yeah.
kitchen is broken and you have to clean them
Hmm.
up. And I'd be like,
All my stuff's off my desk. Come on.
yes, absolutely not a turn on. But for some
No.
reason, super turn on when it comes to Hollywood. Yes.
Hmm.
So that is a type of sex drive. It's more common in men. It's called spontaneous, where desire, somebody's interest in sex, leads to their physical arousal, leads to the blood flowing. Right? But for most women, it happens in the opposite direction. It's called responsive desire, where it's the arousal, the blood flowing that leads to the interest in sex. And this is a game changer for women because if you feel like you're taking too long, no, this is just how your sex drive works. So when your husband tries to initiate, his oven is already warmed up. That's how I think about it, right? Like he's already gone through this process. He's had the interest and his blood has started flowing. So he's coming to you ready to go. The oven is heated. And you're like, I haven't even turned my oven on, right? Like, it's not warm. Like, what's going on, right? Because your body hasn't had the chance to go through this process. And that process takes 20 to 30 minutes. It does for everybody. But it can feel like it takes longer for women because it just works in a different way, right? So we're not going to judge that. It's just biology.
Hmm.
It's like how your brain takes 20 to 30 minutes to catch up to your stomach when you're eating. Sometimes it's super annoying and you overeat and you're full, right? But we're not going to judge it. That's just how it works. So, my point in saying this is that you need that time for the blood flow, right? For the lubrication, for that vaginal tenting so that it can be enjoyable for you. So, when people talk about getting in their head, I'm like, you got to drop down in the body and feel it and not judge it. It's going to take as long as it takes. And sometimes that's going to be 4 minutes. Sometimes that's going to be 4 hours. It doesn't matter how long it takes. What matters is that you are enjoying yourself because that's what gets you out of your head,
Hmm.
right?
I almost, in you using that metaphor and thinking about like an oven, I almost imagine that women were using like fire and like trying to build a fire. It takes a longer time to, and also I'm terrible at doing that, even growing up in Pennsylvania, like putting like the wood together and making sure it's all correct and it's almost like perfect to
Yes.
get things heated.
Exactly. And then the more we judge it, the harder it actually is to get in that space. Because when we go back to like that physical response of anxiety, right? Now your brain, which is your largest sex organ, has started to associate sex with something that is stressful. So it does make it harder to get in the mood and it does take longer because your body's like fighting. These are like opposing systems. Can't be online at the same time. They're fighting each other. So the more we can take that pressure off and focus on the pleasure and focus on slowing down, the easier it gets.
Hmm.
Well, and I'm curious for you, Brittany, about this like getting stuck in my head. Do you ever hear that from your clients?
I do.
Yeah.
I hear a lot about it of like, how can I kind of quiet my anxious thoughts and try to enjoy the moment? And I think I use the moment sometimes broadly, sometimes in sex, might just be trying to get rid of like anxious thoughts. Um, I often tell clients that, that you want to share how you're feeling with your partner, but also not be accusatory in any kind of way, because it's really hard of trying to verbalize what is all going on up in our old noggins. It really is. And I think about like a phrase, that I often use as an example is like, saying, I notice I get anxious when, say, I don't hear from you. If like they're taking some time to get back or maybe not a response is happening. And I acknowledge essentially that I want to work on that. How can we essentially support each other through this? Because I think that helps to open up the dialogue versus like, you're the problem, you need to fix this. Or also the other way of like, I'm the problem and I need to fix this. It's you're right, like with your partner, you're in this team. So why not both work on this together? Um, I also think of other ways is maybe just even through grounding techniques again before entering into maybe that conversation of maybe taking a couple deep breaths. If it's really shallow, like you're just going to still feel amped up in talking to your partner. And I know that we both enjoy physical activity like hiking and that. Maybe it's going for a walk or hike or stretching, even some type of small movement is very helpful. We don't need to go be deadlifting or bench pressing heavy weights to feel that relief, that like anxious relief. Just a little bit of activity even helps. Just to kind of change up and not feel like you're stuck in this anxious moment. And it feels like it's just turning again and again, and you're just sitting there ruminating or stewing in it. It's just change it up. Um, that I feel is always very helpful. Mhm.
Well, and I think that's such a good point too about like shifting things up so that you get unstuck. Because I think a lot of people in today's world too think like, well, I have to have like an hour meditation routine in the morning, and then I have to go for a 4 hour hike in the
Mhm.
afternoon, and then over my lunch break, I have to read 4 chapters of the book. Like, who, first off, who has the time for all that shit, right? The answer is nobody. But I think too, the intention is really important, right? That like discharging this anxious and stressed energy from your body doesn't have to take a long time. You just need the right strategies to do that.
Mhm.
And I think that's
Yeah,
something
and I
people get stuck on.
well, and I think of also knowing what are some maybe like activities that increase that anxiety. I hear a lot from clients of social media, especially when social media is portraying, partners in a certain way of why aren't we going on these vacations? Why aren't you taking pictures of me? Why aren't you giving me these big flowers and stuff? I think that also sets up um, expectations. And I really think of expectations are unrealistic things that we place on ourselves or others, really.
Yes.
Hmm.
And I think that's such a good point. I think I have a love-hate relationship with social media. Anybody in my world knows that. 'Cause I think it can be so helpful in some ways and like syncing you up with like-minded people and resources and experts. There's a lot of people out there nowadays, but also you're inundated by all the shit that you have no control over. It just is there on your feed, and these thoughts are happening before you even realize. And then
Hmm.
the algorithm gets really good, and then it keeps showing you shit like that, right? And then the comparisons happen, and it makes everything worse.
Yeah,
Well, and it makes
absolutely.
me think too about like self-sabotage, right? And I think Brittany, you got another question about self-sabotage,
Hmm.
right?
I did. Yeah. One was about the question is, my anxiety makes me fear the worst, even when things are going well. How can I stop self-sabotaging my relationship? So I actually think, like, especially, I know that I also specialize in OCD, and this is a whole different kind of, I could go down a rabbit hole with that. But when we're just talking about anxiety, the first thing I think about is maybe kind of exploring those thoughts a little bit. You know, Anxiety often convinces us that the worst is going to happen, even when there's no kind of proof that this is going to happen. It gets like 10 steps ahead of us, even though those 10 steps ahead has never happened and may never happen. And then it's almost like trying to predict things before it's even going down that road. Um, and I think of, you know, like asking yourself, like, has my partner ever given me a reason to believe that whatever I'm kind of thinking of, whatever this scenario is that true? I think a lot of it is being curious with yourself and also not judgmental and not taking that anxiety also out on kind of someone else. A lot of it, I think, starts with kind of us and like exploring like what is going on, like what is maybe, triggering this, what's coming up during this time to really understand where this is coming from. And I also think of like communicating instead of assuming, again, right? Like anxiety drives these fears and it might have you withdraw, it might make you become defensive. And it comes back to maybe what a lot of us have heard or have been told at different points of like I statements of not, again, pointing a finger, but maybe, hey, I notice that sometimes I worry about things, even when things are not going wrong. Can we talk about this so I can maybe find support in this or how we can navigate if it's a particular situation that comes up? I think that really takes almost like that defensiveness out. But a lot of it, again, right, is like heading into these conversations, not when you're amped up the most. That's what I think is like pretty important. And I also am curious, like when it comes to, especially with like working with individuals or with couples and that and sex, like how does self-sabotaging come up in your case, Erin?
I am loving this conversation because I like what you're talking about with this whole like communicating an assumption. It's making me think about how thoughts are not facts.
Mm,
And they feel like it in the moment, right? But like think about how often our all or nothing comes in, right? Like we get in a fight and we think this always happens. He'll
mm,
never change, whatever it is, right? Like that's not true. This doesn't always happen, right? People are capable of change, but it's making me think about how, like, for me, what I hear all of the time, well, I'm using all or nothing, what I hear most of the time with women when they reach out is that their main fear is that there is something wrong with them. Their libido has dropped. It's so different than their husbands. They're like, it's so easy for him. It's so hard for me. Like, what is going on? No matter what I try, I like am not in the mood, and this is so hard for me. And they think it must be me. I must be broken. And that thought is like the biggest self-sabotager I see with my clients because as soon as you start to think that and wonder that, now it gets tied to your identity. Well, if it's just me and I'm just broken, then why would I try to do anything different? Why would I even take these steps? Why would I not avoid this thing that scares the shit out of me? Because I think that it's me. So that is one that I think I just want to clear up here for a second because it's not true. Just because you have that feeling doesn't mean that it's true. Because what happens is that, again, we're not taught about this. I love analogies, so because I'm like a very visual person anyway. So it makes me think about the car analogy. And some of you maybe have heard this if you have like listened to podcasts or read books on this. But what happens when desire drops is that it's not usually a desire problem. And that in itself, people are like, what? Yes, it is. It's like affecting my sex drive, right? But it's not usually a sex drive issue. What happens is that there's something standing in the way of the sex drive. There's an obstacle, right? So I think about it like a car. So when it drops, people are like, I'm going to get the lingerie and the toys, and we're going to like get the sexy dice, whatever it is, right? Like all the things people get. They're trying to lay on the gas to get that car moving. When what the problem is that you're also standing on the brakes and the handbrake is on and there's cinder blocks in front of all the tires. So you're not going anywhere, right? So you sabotage yourself by blaming yourself, thinking it's you, thinking there's something wrong with you, when your body is working actually exactly as it should be. But it's this activated stress response. It's this anxiety. It's this nervous system activation that is getting in the way of your sex drive. You have to relieve the pressure on the brakes first so that that car can go somewhere. So instead of blaming yourself, you just need a different in, right? So that you don't keep spinning your wheels, so that you can have those conversations, that you can come from a calm place and stop blaming yourself for something that isn't your fault. It's just that nobody ever taught you about this shit.
Mhm.
But I
I could
love,
imagine how anxiety probably slams on the brakes so much then in this case.
and honestly, it's one of the main breaks that a lot of people deal with today. Like, think about how omnipresent stress and anxiety are in our world. Right? You're in traffic. What happens? You're mad about it, right? You're in line at the grocery store. What happens? You're mad about it, right? Like you miss a call. What happens? You're mad about it, right? Like there's all of this stress that happens, and we don't realize that it has a very real physical impact on us. We might not feel that overwhelming sense of like tension and anxiety, right? But it's there and it's still affecting you physically.
Mhm.
Yeah. Well, and this makes me think
Mhm.
about another question that I got for today. I'm just looking at the time. Yeah, we still have some time to cover some of these. That was about this idea of not knowing how to talk about it. Because I feel like that's one of our themes today, right? Of like, how do I say this? How do I bring this up? So appropriate for our theme today. We suffer in silence and because we don't know what to say. And it's making me think about how that leads us to spiral. So we're left on our own, just becomes an echo chamber in my brain. I think about all the worst case scenarios and all the what ifs. I blame myself, right? So yeah, you need to talk about it. But this is a really important piece because I got a question about like how do I talk about this? Which is an interesting question because there's a lot of different ways you could talk about this. But you don't have to have the answers. And I want to check this out with you, Brittany, because I think this is something that you probably see with your clients too, of like, I feel like I need to know exactly what's going on for me. I need to know exactly what to say. I have to like know the reason why this is happening for me in order to say something to my partner so that's clear to them. And that keeps us from saying anything sometimes and not getting support when it's okay to say, I don't know what's going on for me, but I'm feeling really overwhelmed right now.
Mhm.
Do you
Right, like that's an expectation that you're holding to yourself that you have to have all these answers.
Yeah,
And right, like it's that's a really challenging part because then you have to be vulnerable and say, I don't exactly know what's going on.
exactly.
Mhm.
And how hard is that to get, well, actually so I have a question, Brittany. So this is making me think about not knowing what's going on, right? Like, because what happens often too is that there's not just one singular feeling that we're feeling. There's usually many, and sometimes they're conflicting. And so it's just like this hurricane, and we're like, well, I don't know what's going on. You're trying to figure it out, right? But like figuring out how you feel and then figuring out what to say to your partner, like, where do you suggest people start with that?
Mm,
Even bridge that gap in the first place?
I guess right, like the first part is figuring out how maybe like if you're feeling that like you're having all these emotions show up is calling them out. Whether it's, using the faithful feelings wheel in therapy, which you can just Google feelings wheel and it will come up for you. Or I know like I use an app all the time for clients called like How We Feel. It's a free app to like look through different emotions, to really even have that language for yourself of like, this is what's happening. This is what's happening, to be able to communicate that. But I think it's hard, right? Because we're trying to figure this out for ourselves while also trying to communicate this with our partner. I feel a lot of it, right, like is not just identifying what's going on for us, but pausing also to collect our thoughts and then going like, what do you want to convey in this communication? I think is also an important question to be able to ask yourself. Like, what do you want to talk about? Is it about, avoiding talking about sex? Is it just communicating like, I'm feeling, anxious when you don't do this, or when this situation presents itself, and so forth? Like, what is the kind of drive in that communication? Hmm.
I think that's such an important point, right? Like it's making me think about intentionality. That like pausing, figuring out how we're feeling, which is sometimes easier said than done because sometimes we
Hmm.
don't like give the thought. We know the feeling, but thinking about how to like verbalize this to another person that they understand is difficult. But this idea of the drive is really resonating with me because what it's making me think about is like the intention in the conversation of like what you want to get out of it. Because I think for a lot of us, when we get stressed, when we get overwhelmed, when we're feeling really anxious, how our brains are wired is that we focus in on whatever the threat is in that moment. Right. And we say, I wish I was not so overwhelmed. I don't want to feel so depressed. I don't want to feel so anxious. I don't want to struggle with sex so much. Right. We focus on all the things that we don't want, which is a natural place to start. Right. But it's not actionable. If I say I
Hmm.
don't want to avoid sex anymore, that's a great goal. But what does that mean? Does that mean I want to have more sex? Does that mean I just want to like have an easier time talking about it? Does that mean that I like actually just don't want to have sex at all? I'm like, that's my goal. Like, it's not actionable. So, this idea of like, what is it that you want out of this? What is it that you're seeking? What is it that you want more of? I think is an important piece too in grounding to give you something actionable to bring into that conversation. Because if you talk to your like partner and are just like, well, I don't want to fight about this thing anymore, that's wonderful, but what do we do with that?
Yeah. Or coming in hot and like, I'm feeling angry. Now what? Like, what do you
Okay.
what do you want from
Right. And how
that?
many times have probably all of us like sought support from somebody that we loved and we didn't get that and we just felt worse afterwards because they didn't know what we needed, right?
Hmm.
It's like the classic example of like, do you need to vent or do you need like support or solutions? Right? We need
Hmm.
different things. And so it also, I think, makes it easier for this person to step into that with you when you bring some of that in. And I think you're right, Brittany. I think a theme of today is pausing within yourself first so that you can get that support. So you can get that
Hmm.
validation that at the end of the day, we all want in relationships. We just want to feel seen and loved and accepted.
Hmm. 100%.
Yeah. Well, and I think there was one more question. Is that right? Brittany, I think there
Um,
was a question
there
from
was,
Dr.
I think I was kind of touching on it a little bit. It was
Okay.
like,
Okay.
I love this word because I hear it in clients at different points, but like, what do I do when I'm word vomiting to my husband
The
and
word
feel
vomit.
like, yeah, it happens.
It
And feel
happens.
like my anxiety is running wild. And I mean, it comes back a lot again to like what we keep kind of, I think, going or like and talking about is that kind of pausing and breathing, right? Like before speaking. If it's just like coming out all over the place, it's important, I think, to collect our thoughts and feel because it's going if it's feeling chaotic and coming out, it's also going to be received that way, and your goal in that isn't going to be exactly met because it's just going to be, all over the place if we're word vomiting what's on our mind. So I think a lot of it is, again, right, like pausing, almost like trying to calm that anxiety down as best as we can. Is it going to still be there because maybe we're, you know, I'm going to be talking about something that's stressful, sure, like that's going to still be present, but it's going to come off a lot differently in how we communicate then. Um, it instead of flooding, our partner with what's going on in our mind, like it can even be like I do have a lot on my mind. I'm admitting there's a lot going on and I don't want to overwhelm you. So maybe I'll start with like one thing that I'll share with you of like what's going on for me versus like, here are 10 things, fix all these 10 things right now. Like, I also don't know where to go with that. So I think of like it's starting kind of small and then going up from there.
Well, and I think that's a really good point. This idea of like, if you are feeling like it's coming out chaotically, it probably is, right? Because like you feel chaotic in the moment because you're overwhelmed. And I'm curious, like, what would you, because I like, it's made me think too, what it's made me think about with my clients is that like one thing will turn into another. Because I'm thinking about like around conflict, right? Like we're having this conversation to try to like solve this issue. And suddenly we're fighting about shit that happened 17 years ago. And it's like, wait, how did we get here? Like, what is going on, right? Of like how to catch that in the moment. Like, what do you like when you are working with clients who are like, I noticed the word vomiting, we don't always catch it beforehand.
Hmm.
Like, what would you say to help catch it in the moment and how to like pivot at that?
Mm. So I often tell clients that if they start to notice it literally like in the moment that it's going, um, of saying like, I, I saying then like, I feel overwhelmed right now. This might feel like this might not be a great time. And let me pause for a moment and kind of collect my thoughts. Like I never think of like it is a bad thing to kind of interrupt that because I almost think of it is working backwards then for anxiety. And it happens at times. It's hard to bring awareness in those moments to be able to say like, "Oh yeah, this is about to happen." No, because sometimes we're already like in it, but before we go through it, we can still identify it and be like, "Oh, I want to start making this change right now." And maybe next time that changes a little bit sooner and it gradually moves backwards. It has to start somewhere and you can't have right like maybe an expectation on yourself that it's going to be perfect communication right off the bat. Mistakes happen all the time. You and I still make them all the time.
All the time.
and and I even catch myself of like, oh, hold on, let me, my mind is going a couple different directions, let me, you know, kind of backtrack a little bit here, backpedal, and like, let me go down this one road first. And then we'll see how where we want to go. And I don't, there's nothing wrong with stopping and pivoting in that way, I feel.
Yes. And I think that's such a good point. Like, no one's an expert the first time they do anything. And it's making me think about like when I talk to my clients about the change process, because something that I want to be really upfront with them about is that like you don't just suddenly have this aha moment and then sex just gets really easy and felt like, no, it's a process, right? And what this is making me think about, like before we, and I want to get your thoughts, before we catch it in the moment, is that I always talk about change happening in the opposite way that we think it is, right? We think that like I learned this thing and then I do it different. And that is not usually how it works. It's usually I learn this thing, right? I'll use the idea of like using I statements during conflict, right? I learned that an I statement is helpful and that I should do it. And then the next time I have conflict, I don't use that shit. I don't even think about it. And then 2 days later, I'm like, oh, that was one of those times. That probably would have been helpful.
Hmm.
And then the next time
Hmm.
I have conflict and I still don't use it, but maybe the next day, I'm like, oh,
Hmm.
damn it. Okay, that was a moment. And then the next time, right after the fact, I'm like, I probably could have helped if I had just like been a little
Hmm.
kinder in how I communicated and talked about myself. And then I catch it in the moment, right? And it's like it works backwards. And then eventually you catch it beforehand. But I think that's something people don't realize. And then they're really hard on themselves that they're like, well, why? I like know that this thing that I'm doing isn't helpful, but like, why do I keep doing it? And it's like, it's just because change happens different than we think it's going to. But the more awareness you bring in, the more you practice, like earlier it steps back and the easier it gets.
Hmm. And I think that it's also is challenging, whenever we're bringing awareness to something that we want to change, like, and we want to do something different. Sometimes it is the challenging part I'm thinking about is like maybe even some shame and guilt comes up, and then because we're acknowledging something that we're doing and we want to change. And that in itself can be is very hard. It's
Oh,
not an easy process.
it's really hard to look in the mirror sometimes and be like, I'm doing this thing that sucks and doesn't serve me, and it maybe is like hurtful to people around. It's really hard to admit that stuff, right? But at the end of the day, it's
Mhm.
just patterns of behavior. And we have to become aware of them to change them. So, like, while that is difficult, yes, it's less difficult to continue to do these things that are not helpful,
Mhm.
right?
Yeah. Right. And in changing that pattern, we're also trying to break habits and behaviors we already have going on for who knows how long they've been going on. It takes time to undo that to then do something different.
Exactly. And those
If
patterns are
if
there
we
for,
want to get technical about it, it's like rewiring our brain. We're talking
yeah,
about new neural pathways, but
it's exactly what's happening.
Mhm.
Exactly. And the patterns that we have are there for a reason, right? That like maybe I'll just stick with this same. Apparently, my example is being really defensive during conflict, but I'll stick with the same example, right? That like if I have been really defensive during conflict in the past, it's because I want to protect myself and I didn't want to be hurt and I didn't want to be vulnerable, right? That these patterns are there for a reason, and that's okay that they're there. It's also okay
Mhm.
if you want them to be different if they're not serving you anymore. And I think that the permission is big because the guilt, the shame, right? Like the embarrassment are all very real when we are
Mhm.
honest with ourselves about things that we want to change. And it's also okay if we want those things to be different,
Mhm.
you know?
Yeah.
Yeah,
I think it's just like it's not just anxiety, it's a whole slew of things that come into relationships and also ourselves.
exactly. Many pieces to the puzzle, we'll say, right? But shifting a
Yep.
few can change your whole outlook on the whole picture.
Mhm.
So okay.
Mhm.
So that was all the questions we got for today. So before we hop off, I just want to say thank you so much for coming. We had some amazing stuff we covered today. I love talking about this stuff. It sounds really weird, but I'm like, I could talk about stress and anxiety all day, right? Like, let's get stressed out and anxious and talk about it. And I know that Brittany and I like love having these conversations and we want to help more so that you don't fall into I call it the knowledge acquisition trap, right? Where we just learn a bunch of stuff and that feels good and we get the dopamine hit, but then we don't do anything with it because we don't know how. It's a trap that so many people like so many of us fall in, right? Like I have been there so many times. I can't tell you how many times I've gone down the Google rabbit hole for hours and then never actually applied any of the shit that I learned. It's embarrassing, right? Thinking about that guilt and that shame. I'm embarrassed about it. But we want to help you not fall into that and not just get all this information and not know what to do with it. So if you're like, yep, same, I fall into that. Brittany and I are here for helping you break that cycle and go from knowing to doing. So as a reminder, Brittany is a specialized OCD and anxiety therapist who can help you break free from intrusive thoughts and manage anxiety more effectively and reclaim your peace of mind. And I'm a sex therapist who specializes in helping women stop dreading sex and start enjoying it again by taking action to take the pressure off of those brakes and turbocharge your pleasure and deepen that connection in your relationship. So, the link to book a call for both of us is going to be below this recording so that you can get your next steps and so that we can be here to help you stop spiraling in silence and start living the life that you were meant to live. So, thank you all so much for coming. We had so much fun. Love talking about this stuff. If you want to chat more, reach out, let us know. We would love to help and have this conversation.
Yeah, 100%.
Yeah.
Thank
And
you so much,
Brittany,
Erin.
where
Yeah.
can they contact you if they want to learn more?
Yeah, so can visit our website, which is like bettermindscounseling-services.com, or we've got a lot of information on our Instagram when that is just Better Minds Counseling. So,
Love it. This is not the last time I'm sure we will host an event like this. So hopefully we will see you all again next time. But thank you so much for coming. We had so much fun.
yeah, thank you all.
All right. Bye, everybody.